So my name is Bill Woodson. I'm a doctoral student in the College of Education, Human Development, and focus on higher education leadership, the OLPD track. And I have no background, particularly in law enforcement. Actually, my personal background is in corporate and then also some academic administrative work. But I became intrigued as I started transitioning from part-time to full-time doctoral student in the issue of the poor relations between law enforcement and community. And I had a sense that there was a way to bring a different lens to the challenges of law enforcement and community relations that maybe my focus on higher education, organizational effectiveness, and leadership could bring some insight to. And what I've come to is the notion that there is a need for more people of color in law enforcement, and that there's a need for higher education institutions, even flagship institutions like the University of Minnesota, which has traditionally not been very involved in thinking in terms of vocational direction in higher ed, but more so in terms of primary research and that type of thing, that we really need to be deeply involved in this. That sense that I have has been validated and reinforced by work that the Department of Justice has done in their analysis of 21st century policing and where communities need to go to improve relations and increase effectiveness of law enforcement. It's also been reinforced by a number of conversations with local law enforcement leaders, local sheriffs and police chiefs and deputy chiefs, and those also involved in training and recruitment. So there's no surprise, I'm sure, that there's a pretty significant underrepresentation, even given the proportions of people of color in the state of Minnesota, that if you look particularly in the urban areas at the representation in law enforcement, that law enforcement does not look much like the communities that they're policing, particularly looking at urban areas. And you might think, well, it's a pretty simple reason. Why is it that more people of color aren't attracted to law enforcement? You think about the brand of law enforcement in the communities in general, and particularly in the black community, although my focus is really broader than just the African American community, but certainly we've seen this very, very painful dialogue, and this very painful history, especially recently as we have more and more video evidence of the kind of treatment that people are getting at the hands of law enforcement, with men of color, African American men, seeming to bear the brunt of that. But as it turns out, the reasons for the lack of participation of law enforcement by people of color, African Americans and others, is not just specifically around the poor branding of law enforcement, although that certainly is a part of it. In conversations with law enforcement leaders, certainly that damaged relationship is a major factor, but there's also the pipeline by which you start out on the front end and end up being a sworn officer is really a fairly difficult or not well understood outside of people who have law enforcement folks in their background, or maybe they have a military background. And actually, if you talk to law enforcement leaders about the type of profile, the type of person they're looking to attract to law enforcement, it's quite a bit different from the brand of law enforcement in terms of the history and the context of law enforcement. Has really been more of a sort of a warrior mentality: war on drugs, war on crime, and armed warriors to protect and defend the community, to enforce compliance. What law enforcement leaders, what the Department of Justice is talking about now, is that there's a need for more of a guardian mindset, a mindset that really is marked by high empathy levels, high levels of communication. If you think about how we've transitioned to where mental health issues and crises are often first dealt with by law enforcement officers. People who are suicidal, family conflicts, and you need to have people who have those types of skills. Also, we're a much more multicultural world today. Our communities, especially our urban communities, are more multicultural, and we need to have people who really have a high level of capacity to interact with people effectively who are not like themselves, who have a different background. So we're talking about not just the racial mismatch, but also the fact that we really need to have not just a different ethnic identity, but also a different mindset of law enforcement. Now, universities and colleges have a very important role to play in law enforcement development because, especially in the state of Minnesota, you have to have a 2 or 4 year degree plus specialized training before you can even apply to a job in law enforcement. And if you think about the cost and the implications of having to commit as a college freshman to a career path in law enforcement, that's not typically going to happen, right? If you're a person of color, you're not necessarily thinking about law enforcement. Now, what I've found through some research that I've done is that if you introduce the concept of being prepared for careers in law enforcement or other community-serving functions like emergency response, like social work, like urban policy, and if you tie that proposition of being prepared for those careers with internships and also with scholarship support, people of color are actually very interested in that. They find that a very engaging, very intriguing value proposition. But that proposition doesn't exist today, and that's what the Community Justice Workforce Pipeline Initiative is meant to address. And I think you need a flagship university like the University of Minnesota to really have that brand power combined with the scholarship support that we can open up a new pathway for young people into law enforcement. And it's certainly going to be targeted to young people of color, but I think it's also anyone who has a background that would prepare and position them to engage with communities that have traditionally been underserved and would have passion and heart for that type of work. So we're talking also first-generation students and students from low-income backgrounds of any racial background would also be targets for this initiative. So if you look at the top half of this page right now, you're talking about basically there's 3 talent pools out there that you might expect to draw into law enforcement. You have people who have law enforcement connections in their family, and they have a good insight into how to navigate that space, how to prepare themselves for those careers. They may often come to college knowing that they're going to pursue that pathway, and they know what coursework they need. They know the types of experiences that will help position them to be successful in competing for a job in law enforcement. You also have ex-military, and most police departments have a facilitated pathway, particularly for people who have a military background. And that pathway is more accelerated. Maybe it only takes 9 months if they already have a 2 or 4 year degree. And if you look at most law enforcement officers today, that's their background. It's one of those 2 pools, the majority of them. Now, this third pool I've identified, people who are motivated to community service, people who have exceptional communication skills, empathy, judgment. There's really no pathway that exists today that would draw them towards a career in law enforcement, even though that's the profile that law enforcement leaders are telling us that they require. And so what we have as an outcome is typically new law enforcement officers, there's very little representation of people of color, certainly not representative of the numbers in the community that they serve. So this alternate pathway, this career pathway that I'm suggesting that University of Minnesota engage would target in outbound communication to high schools, to community colleges, that we're looking for people, not necessarily for law enforcement specifically. We want to broaden that positioning to be community service as being the key focal point. So people who are interested in careers potentially in social work, in emergency response, in urban public policy, and providing scholarship support and internships that allow them to test drive those experiences while they're in college. And what we think that'll draw a much more diverse pool, and that will drive eventually a diverse pool coming into law enforcement. In conclusion, what we're looking for at this point is to drive into foundations, state and federal government to find funding for this program. We're also in conversation with our faculty, particularly in the sociology department. Believe it or not, there are 30 schools in the state that have the specialized training you need to be able to post for a job in law enforcement. University of Minnesota is not currently one of those 30 schools. And so we want to get University of Minnesota not only to be a part of the process of developing next generation law enforcement leaders, but to be a leader and an innovator in that space.